Well, today it's exciting for me because this is the culmination of many years of work that we have done with the people at Oculus. Andrea Steinmuller has been the head engineer that I've worked with for many, many years now. And Rainer Kirchhoff, George, and Chris O'Flaherty, Michael Wolber are all people that I've been working with at the company that have been very helpful in making sure and understanding that our goal is to try to make a report on the Pentacam that is easy to understand by the ophthalmologist and something that is easy to use in the clinic and makes sense so you don't have to memorize a lot of stuff. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today and what I'm going to show you. Here are the companies that I consult with. The one that's relevant this morning, of course, is Oculus. And they are making available to you the interpretation guidelines, which go through the exact detail of how to use the Pentacam efficiently and explains all of the things that you need to understand. So we're going to go through this this morning, but you should have two things in front of you. One is the slide presentation, but the other is the interpretation guidelines. And the interpretation guideline, as I said, is for you to go through in detail to understand what it is. And I have these available on my website also. You go up to Doc Holladay and then go to handouts. And it also has other handouts that we have here at the Academy. Now, the version that, the software version that you should have on your Pentacam should be at least what they call build 1.20, build 76 or later. Okay? So when you look at your Pentacam, you'll see that it on there will have what the build is. It has the version down in that lower right-hand corner. And you should have version 76. And if you don't, then either Michael Wolber or Chris O'Flaherty will help you, and they can actually do that with a remote session where they get that on. All right? Now, one of the things that we've done, you no longer have to worry about. When you pull up the Holladay report, it was so frustrating to me. I went through and I set all these up, and we had a little thing that you could save the Holladay setting, but every time I would get a report from doctors, they would have changed that to the absolute setting so that diopters were in 2 diopter steps, microns were in 15 microns, and everything that you'd come up with would be green. And I'll show you that in a minute. Well, that's gone. When you pull up the Holladay report now, you cannot, it comes up with a default setting that are settings that I've set so that all the colors, all the step sizes and everything else with these builds that are less than or greater than 76 are set for you. So you don't have to worry about them. Now this is what I'm talking about. We've tried to make this so simple. Okay? Green is normal. Blue colors are in the direction of the cool colors, and blue are basically things that are a little better than average. And orange, yellow, orange, and towards the red end of the spectrum, the warm colors are bad. So when you see red, you know you have a problem. When you see blue or green, you know the patient's good. So you look at this exam and you say, what? Everything's green, it's absolutely normal. All right, now this is what I get, but look at a couple of things. They don't have the Holladay setting here. This thing goes up in 2 diopter steps. It's got pink at the top and purple at the bottom. And the point is, this same exam, okay, with the settings, they've got the step sizes over here in microns that are in 14 diopter steps. Same thing over there. The thicknesses are in there. And so the values on here, they've changed to a default setting. And here's the same exact patient. That's the same map. Here's the map with what the guy sent me. Okay. Well, right there. And here's the map with the Holladay settings. Okay, it's night and day. Well, now it doesn't take a genius to say, there's something wrong with this. Okay, and when you look at it, we're going through the details on these, but the point is that now the setting comes up exactly that way, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now you can, and I hate to tell you this, you can go over a scale, right click on it and change it, but I don't recommend that you do that. And then if you go look at another exam and then come back, it'll automatically always load up with this scale and these settings, so you can modify them. But when you reload it, it always goes back to the default. All right? So you don't have to do that anymore, where you can lock the settings to whatever you've done for all the other maps so that all the things come up the way you want, but it won't change the Holladay report. It'll come up the same way every time you do it. Now, not only does it have the settings for the sensitivity, the scale, the colors, and all that stuff, but it also has the other map overlays that I've shown here that I'll show you on the maps, that show you where the thinnest point is, that show you where the steepest curvatures are. All of these things are on there also, and they've been optimized so there's not things on the map that clutter up, and there's not things that you need on the map that are not shown. All right, so let's take a look at the map first. All right. Now, upper left-hand corner, demographics, name, all the stuff that you need to know about the patient to identify him. Upper middle, K readings and parameters for lens calculations, okay? Upper right, additional measurements that give you things also related to refractive surgery and to cataract surgery. And we'll talk about what those are in a minute. First column are your traditional topographic maps, okay? These are, the top one is your sagittal map, the bottom one is your tangential map. We'll talk about what those are. Next column are thicknesses. Top map is your normal corneal thickness map. Bottom map is what we call the relative pachymetry map, which is in percent. And it tells you what the thickness is at every point relative to what it should be, okay? And then the right map are the elevations of the front surface on the top and the back surface on the bottom, and they are relative to a prolate toric ellipsoid, that is the normal surface of the cornea, so it shows you abnormalities. All right? Now, let's just talk about these boxes a little bit, and then we'll go through some things. But in the upper top middle, as I said, in that top box are the K readings that you'd use in an IOL calculation. They're called the EKR65. But in the majority of your patients, those K readings that are up there for the steep and the flat and the axes are the ones that you'd use in an IOL calculation, whether it's post-refractive, keratoconus, post-corneal transplant, and in standard. Because what those measurements have done is they've taken into account the back surface astigmatism on the cornea. They've converted them to values called the EKR65, which eliminates the need to change them in a way that goes to any available formula that's currently available today. In other words, if you go to the Asterisk website, you can use True Net Power, TNP, because the true net power of the cornea is about 1 diopter less than equivalent K reading. That's what EKR stands for, equivalent K reading. So if I measure 45 diopters with the keratometer, I will end up, when I convert that to true net power, of about 44 diopters. So it'll be about 1 diopter flatter than a K reading. Okay, and that's the true net power of the cornea. And every single intraocular lens formula, from the Holladay to the Binkors to the Hoffer Q to every single formula out there today, the first step is to convert that from a K reading to true net power. Okay, now we argue a little bit about what the net index of refraction that you should use, so we don't all get the same answer, but it's within 1/4 of a diopter of 1 diopter less than the K reading every time you do it, okay? So Hoffer Q may make it 44.12 for a 45. Holladay 2 may make it 43.8, but I'm saying all of those reduce it by 1 diopter plus or minus about 1/4. That's the difference between the formulas. Well, if you take that 44, that 1 diopter less, and plug it into one of the lens formulas, it doesn't know that you've made that conversion already. So the result is it reduces it down to 43, and all of a sudden you put in a K reading that's 1 diopter flatter than you meant to, okay? The true net power is the 44, 1 diopter less than that 45. So in the study that they did on the ASCRS website, Rick Kotkin, when he put that number in, took the 44, and it turns out that for post-refractive surgery patients, that a 44 number for post-refractive surgery patients is a value that's better than you would on a normal patient, because we usually overestimate the power of a cornea in somebody that's had myopic LASIK. So when you put in that 44, it sort of makes an error on the low side, compensating for the error that we overestimate the cornea. So it comes out a little bit more myopic than it should, is what happens. The EKR 65 has already done all that. It takes it, and if it comes out to be the true net power when we measure both the front and back surface, the EKR 65 adjusts it so that it gives you back a K reading, but compensates for the abnormality in the back surface of the cornea. So if the cornea was, say, 1/2 diopter steeper than normal, so that the back surface power would have been 1/2 diopter less, well, then it reports, instead of 45, it reports back to you 44.5, because it takes the abnormality in the back surface of the cornea, compensates for that, and then gives you back the K reading that you should enter into every formula available today so that you come out with the right answer. So the point is, the EKR 65 does not require you to go to the ASCRS website. It's already got everything built in, so it takes care of that automatically and works for keratoconus, transplants, anything with irregular astigmatism. All right. Now, the other values that are up there that you can see are, it's also got a Q value, it's got the spherical aberration, it's got the ratio and the corneal power of the map. Now, the Q value you really don't need, because the spherical aberration is the number that in microns is how you choose the right aspheric intraocular lens. Okay, there's only 3 in the United States that are available right now anyway. They're the 3 companies that make the aspheric lenses. The AMO lens, which is the Technis, is minus 0.27. Okay? The Wavefront lens from Alcon is minus 0.18. And the Wavefront lens from B&L is 0. Okay? So you have 3 choices: 0, minus 18, and minus 27. So when you look up at that little box in the center up there, like on this patient, it is, the total is 0.2444. All right. All you have to do is say, gee, which of those 3 is closer to the positive value in the patient? And the answer is plus 0.244 is closest to minus 27. So in this patient, you're going to end up with almost 0 when you choose a minus 27 lens. And it's always best to have it 0 or slightly negative. Now, there's a lot of confusion about that. People say, well, gee, a little positive spherical aberration gives you depth of field. For an equal amount of spherical aberration, there's one thing that's overlooked when you make a statement like that, and that is, when you look at something up close, your pupil constricts. And when you constrict, if you have negative spherical aberration in your ocular system, you get more power. And if you have positive spherical aberration in your optical system, you get less power when the pupil constricts. And you want more power because for the same amount of positive and negative spherical aberration, the blur at distance is equal. So for that blur, when you look up close and your pupil gets smaller, you'd like to have a little bit more plus power in exchange for that little bit of blur in the spherical aberration that you had for distance, positive or negative. So you want to be a little bit on the negative side if you can't get zero. But you look up at that box, and what Doug Koch's paper showed is it's not just the Z40 term, it's the 40, the 60, and the 80. So we measure those three, add them together, and that is the number that you should look for to neutralize your lens. Okay? So you look at that box, and that tells you which one of the aspheric lenses to use.
Jack,
Yes?
the Q value accumulation of the 40, 60, and 80 wavefront values, is that what you just said?
Yes, it's the sum of those three values. And that's what we do. In other words, if you look at Koch's paper, it's in the reference at the end of those things. But if you look at that, because the Zernike, it gets a little detailed, but the Zernike term is a sombrero, okay? And that's not really what you want. You really want the parabola. In other words, spherical aberration actually increases all the way out linearly. It doesn't come back down and go through zero. That's a result of Zernike's transformation. And so what Koch found out is you can make that a gradual increase in spherical aberration if you take the Z40, the Z60, and the C80, and you add them all together, you do get the parabola, okay? So what his paper shows is the sum of those three terms is the value to use to neutralize what the companies report, because they also report the spherical aberration in Zernike terms, but it's not the 40, it's the sum of those three. Yes?
The EKR, do you still have to put in the pupil size when you're doing your measurements?
Well, we're going to see a picture of that, but the question was, what about the pupil size? Okay, now let's talk about that. Okay, so are we clear on the Zernike term to use? In other words, when you're trying to neutralize spherical aberration, that box takes the 40, the 60, and the 80 and adds them together and comes up with a value. Now, it'll turn out the 40 term will be about 24.24. The 60 term will be down in the hundredths. It'll be 0.04. And the 8 term will be down in the hundredths to thousandths. So the last two terms, even though they make it a little bit better statistically, are not a big deal. Even if you only use the 40 term, it's always 10 times bigger than the next term anyway. All right? But what Koch found in that paper is the sum of those three did a better job in predicting the spherical aberration post-operatively than if you just used the 40. So that's why we did it. Okay, is that clear? Okay. Now, the question about pupil size in the EKR 65. All right. A K reading uses a ring, okay? It doesn't look at a zone, it measures a ring, okay? So when you take a K reading that's 45 diopters, what you've actually done on a manual keratometer is you've measured a ring that's 3.2 millimeters in diameter. Doesn't measure anything inside that ring or anything outside of that ring. Okay, so it's a ring. Now, on the Scheimpflug, on the Pentacam, when we take a measurement, it actually takes thousands of points, fits a surface, and calculates the best three-dimensional fit, and then calculates what the best radius to estimate that would be. So it looks at a zone. All right, so let me ask you a question. If we were trying to correlate the keratometric reading with a ring with a zone on a Scheimpflug, all right, and let's just do it backwards. Let's say I took a 4.5 millimeter zone, okay? Now, if you were to pick a ring that said, okay, I can only get one ring on that 4.5 millimeter zone, where would you choose the diameter of that ring? Would you put it at 4.5 millimeters on the outside? Would you put it at 2 millimeters, make it a little bitty? Or would you put it somewhere in between? Okay, now let me ask you one other question. What do you think for a 4.5 millimeter zone would be the diameter of a ring that would split those two areas into half? So you had 50% of the area in the ring and 50% of the area outside of the ring. Would it be half the diameter of 4.5? No, it'd be the square root of 2. In other words, to get 50, because the area of a circle is a square, it turns out that the area that splits those 50-50 is 3.2. Okay? Not 2 1/4, but 3.2. Now guess what? That's why if you try to correlate K readings with a 4.5 millimeter diameter zone, the highest correlation occurs when the zone is 4.5 millimeters, because the ring is 3.2 on a manual keratometer. When you do it on the IOL Master, it's about 2.5, so it's about 4. It's a little bit less, okay? So the point is, if you want to correlate zonal K readings with ring keratometric readings, you'll find that the diameters that have the best correspondence are those in which the diameter of the keratometer is the square root of whatever the diameter of the zone is. So 3.2 and 4.5 are the two values that correlate. So the reason why the 4.5 millimeter zone on the Pentacam has the best correlation with the keratometer in normal people with a 3.2 diameter is because of what we just said. That ring sample, you want to have the areas split 50-50. All right. So that's why the 4.5 millimeter zone is the one that gives you the best thing, because it looks at the whole area, and the normal pupil in a refracting lane of a patient when you're trying to refract them on post-cataract patients is about 4.5 millimeters. Okay? Now, when you walk outside and your pupil gets down to 3 millimeters, the depth of field makes that not as critical. So you want to do it with the larger pupil anyway, because that's the one where the refraction matters the most. Because when you walk outside in bright light and your pupil comes down, your depth of field kicks into where if you've got a half a diopter refractive error, it doesn't matter. All right. The only, okay, so that's why the 4.5 millimeter zone works the best. Now, if you have a patient that's had refractive surgery, okay, myopic refractive surgery, and it's not in the last couple of years because we've worked out the optics to where it's a lot better. Prior to 5 years ago, when we did a myopic refractive surgery, the power of the cornea is not constant. The power of the cornea actually dips down and is lower in the dead center of the cornea than it is as you start moving out. That's spherical aberration, basically. So if a person is plano in the center, he starts getting more myopic as you go out to the periphery. So here's what happens. When you look on that EKR65, if you see between the 4.5, the 4, and the 3 millimeter zone, that power drops down by almost a diopter post-refractively, well then, yes, I would edge towards the 3 millimeter because you know that person has a multifocal cornea, and that if you use the 4.5 millimeter zone, that basically you may end up a quarter or a half a diopter hyperopic. And that if you go up just a little bit further down, it'll be flatter, that'll tip you to where the patient will end up minus a quarter, minus a half. The other thing that's important to know is that it does measure the back surface of the cornea. So in the 90% of the people that have against the rule, it does that. But in the 10% that don't, it measures the right back surface power and gives you a K reading that's accurate. Now, all right, so that's those numbers up there. Now we're going to talk about, but there's one other thing. When you look at that map, the sagittal map, the upper left-hand corner map, what you're going to see is, you see how those vertical bar is broken a little bit? You see there's a 3, a 5, and a 7 millimeter zone, and they don't form a perfect line. Well, what that means is the astigmatism in the 3 millimeter zone is not at the same axis as it is in the 5 millimeter zone, and that's not the same as the 7 millimeter zone. When you see that broken bar, and the same thing in the horizontal, you know that a toric lens, there's not one axis that you can identify that's absolutely perfect. And the EKR has taken the Stiles-Crawford effect, the 4.5 millimeter pupil, and everything else we can think of into effect, but it tells you that the variability in this patient is such that those broken lines means that they have irregular astigmatism, and the answer that we've given you is softer than the guy that's got an absolutely perfect cross there with no broken line. So you know the person that's going to have an inexact location for the intraocular lens because those broken lines are there. And you also see that they break onto the same side. So this guy's got a little crab claw kind of a shape, not one that goes off this way and off this way. It goes like this. There's no way to do, you can't bend an intraocular lens so that that axis does that. So the quality of this guy's vision is going to be a little softer, okay? Just because there's no way, because it's not all regular astigmatism. All right, now that's best to see on the sagittal map. The tangential map is much more sensitive, about 2 to 1. It doesn't care what the master big curvature of the cornea is looking at local radii, but it's still helpful to look at, but it's so much more sensitive that most people have broken lines there, and the upper one's the best. All right. Now, final thing on the upper right, those symbols give you the pupil diameter, the white to white, the minimum pachymetry, and the location of where those are that we'll talk about just a little bit. We've been over the power map, the thickness map. Now I want you to notice that that little black circle that's in the middle there is the thinnest point. Those little brackets are where the center of the limbus are. The little plus sign with the white dot is vertex normal, okay? And it's normal for that vertex normal to be on the nasal side, and the center of the limbus and the thinnest point to be a little temporal and a little down. And by a little, just about the amount that you see there. And we're going to see in people where that's not separated by a small distance, it's going to be a flag to us that something's wrong with that cornea. Okay? So when that thinnest point is not where it looks like there, a little temporal, then we know that that's a problem. But the exact values are in the upper right. Now, relative thickness map. Again, yellow colors are suspicious, red colors are danger. All right? And again, it gives you the percentage of how much thicker or thinner the cornea should be at that point. All right? So it's percentages. If it's thicker, you don't care. If it's thinner, you look at it. But if it's yellow, it's just suspicious. And then on the right, elevations, we shouldn't have things pooching forward on the front or the back, or we get suspicious. But yellow, again, is suspicious. Red is a problem. Okay. Yes?
On the EKR, so if we measure on a standard eye, measure the mesopic pupil, say it's 5. We should not adjust 4.5 just leave it alone at this point?
Yes, because larger than 4.5 you got a Stiles-Crawford effect where peripheral rays, even with people with large pupils, doesn't matter that much. All right. In other words, those peripheral rays don't contribute to the image very much. So 4.5 is the largest that you'd ever use. So you may go down, but you'd never go up.
Hyperopic LASIK, post-hyperopic LASIK would be changed.
No, same thing. But remember, though, the error is in the opposite direction with hyperopia. So what happens is in a myopic LASIK, we underestimate the power, all right? We overestimate the power. Cornea is a little flatter than we expect. In a hyperopic LASIK, we underestimate the power because that's steep. In other words, what happens is we get a trough in a myope, we get a peak in a hyperope, so that central power is a little bit stronger. So you'll have a tendency to have a hyperopic surprise, all right, in somebody because the center of that cornea in a myope is actually a little flatter than you thought, okay? And it's just the opposite in a hyperope. All right, so now let's look. All right, now these are the symbols, okay? Center of the cornea, the thinnest part of the cornea, and that plus, that black cross is the center of the pupil, okay? Now we just look at those symbols and it gives you the coordinates. And what I'm saying is that the coordinates of where the thinnest point are and stuff should always be down in the, in the low tenths, but not very big. Now there's a bunch of tables in there. Q values, pupil diameters, corneal diameters and stuff. But again, we've already taken all that into account with the color code. So yellow is suspicious and red, so you don't have to worry about all these tables, but the values are there if you want to look at them. And all it does is it says when things are 2 standard deviations, they start turning yellow, and when they're over 3, they turn red. Okay, so that's what those values are in all of those tables that are there. All right, now let's look at a couple of things. So let's look at this patient's cornea. All right, so the first thing we look up there, we see okay, so we look up at the K values up there. We see that the guy blinked. You see that QS, that's the quality of the exam. And it says there's a blink. Now when that happens, what you should do is you should click through those various slices and see how many times he blinked or see how many of the slices were affected by that blink. And if there was a lot of them, you should tell your technician, if that thing comes up like that and it says blink and it's yellow, repeat the exam. Okay? Because what it means is that the lids were closed for a large number of those slices, and so it's not accurate. So whenever they get that QS value that comes out and it's yellow, tell them, have the patient, oh, and that, by the way, when you do an exam, okay, number one, how many of you tell your technicians if the patient is a little dry to go ahead and put a drop in the eye before you take the exam? Raise your hand, okay? That's a mistake. And the reason for that, what you've done is you've eliminated all those patients who have dry eyes, and after surgery, they're going to have the same thing they had before. And the result is that they are going to end up with poor performance, quality of vision. And by you putting a drop in, it covers all the problems. In other words, what happens is you've created an artificial situation and you had the ability to detect that guy that had a problem. What they should do when they do an exam is you should tell them, first of all, you should have the patient blink several times and then say, okay, go ahead and blink, 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 blink. Okay, now fixate or stare. And then they stare at that, and within a half a second, they should hit that button. But what they do sometimes is they'll say, okay, now look, I want you to look at that target, and then they're focusing, okay? And then by the time that patient's still focusing, he's looking at the thing, and when they get it in there, 3 to 5 seconds have gone by, and bam, they hit the button. That's a mistake because they've dried the patient's eye out. So you let the patient blink normally, and you actually tell them to blink, and then when you say, okay, stop blinking and stare, and bam, within a half a second, you hit that button. But by putting drops into the eye, you eliminate the ability to see those broken lines. Okay, you won't pick that up. So it's not a good idea to put any drops in a person's eye when you're taking them. Now, how many of you dilate the patient and have them in the exam? They come in, you find out they give a history, they have a cataract, you've dilated them, and now you take the topography. How many of you do it at the end of the exam after they've had dilating drops? You should never do that. They should always get the topography or tomography, the Pentacam, before you put anything in the eye, and you have to make sure that they blink frequently and are not staring at that for 5 seconds before you hit the button. Okay? So make sure that you go through your set technicians and you just do it on me one time and do it just like you would for a patient, and then you find out. But make sure that they have the patient blinking frequently and then stop, bam, half a second later, so you can focus while they're blinking. And then when you get it in the right position, stare and then bam, okay? But it should be within 1 second of the time that they stare. It should never be more than 1 second after the last blink. That's the point. All right, so we look up here. We see, okay, their Zernike term is $399. So this guy's got a lot of spherical aberration. He's got a little break in the line up there. And the amount of astigmatism that he has is 1.31. And by the way, the higher the amount of astigmatism, the more important those broken lines are. If you got 1 diopter of astigmatism and the lines are broken, well, it's not that bad. But if you got 2.5, then there's no way you're going to be able to line up that high-powered toric lens. You see all these breakups over here. It's a little bit of an asymmetric bow tie. We see the circle is down, and we find out that that thinnest point now is almost 0.75. That's a little bit unusual. Relative pachymetry is pretty good. And we've got an elevation on the back that's at about 9 microns and 7 microns on the front. Okay, well, you know, I will tell you that this is nothing more than a little difference between the eyes, but this guy is suspicious because of that elevation on the back, but it wouldn't change anything that I'd do if I were doing cataract surgery, and I would actually, because it's just suspicious, and that elevation on the back doesn't correspond to anything with a difference in the relative pachymetry map. In other words, if that were at the same point and it was thinner, well, I'd be a little worried about doing LASIK on that guy, but I wouldn't affect anything here because the relative pachymetry map is not at the same place as the elevation, and it's just suspicious. So I'm not worried about it, basically, is what I'm saying. All right. Now, the other thing that I see on here, though, is this. This is a distribution of the power on the cornea in the 4.5 millimeter zone. And what I see is this guy's got 2 peaks. And what we do in the software when that occurs, we go in and we find out what the best K reading is on that patient. If you had keratoconus, which this guy doesn't, but it's suspicious, he's got a bifocal cornea, what happens is it's like a bifocal intraocular lens. When you look at distance, you don't use the bifocal part, and when you look up close, you don't use the distance part. If you were to take a keratoconus patient, and usually they have a 4 to 5 diopter difference between the cap and the paracentral area, what you would find is if you took a reading card and held it at 20 centimeters, he could read that. And he does it through the cap on the cornea because it's like a +5 bifocal. All right, but when he looks at distance, that image is out of focus on the retina, and the paracentral cornea is what's used for his vision. So we do that. We calculate, look at those areas and figure out what it is. But anyway, whenever you see something like this that doesn't have a sharp peak, you know that your lens calculation is going to be a little bit suspect simply because the guy's got a bifocal cornea. But he never looks through the average power. The biggest mistake I ever see in keratoconic eye, you know, the guy's got mild keratoconus, he doesn't need a transplant, you do cataract surgery. The keratometer takes the cap. So they end up with K readings that are 48 or 45, 48, 49. And the result is the guy ends up +4. And it's because he's not looking through the 49. He's looking through the 44 paracentral power, and that's the value that you have to use for the IOL calc. They always come out with a hyperopic surprise because the cap, he doesn't look halfway between 44 and 49 for a 46. He looks through the 44. And then when he looks up close, he looks through the 49. So the point is, it's the paracentral power, just like a bifocal lens. You don't look through the average of the bifocal part and the distance part all the time. You look through one or the other, and it's the same way when it's on the cornea. Okay. So, now, a couple of things. Thinning disorders. You're doing refractive surgery. Now, we're looking for red on the map, okay? But here is one of the biggest clues that you'll get, and that is, when you look on that map and that black circle, which is the thinnest point on the cornea, is not that little distance that was like about 0.2 or 0.3 millimeters, but it's down at 0.8 or 0.9, there is a problem. So a thinning disorder, the very first thing you notice is the thinnest point of the cornea is no longer 2 or 3/10 of a millimeter from vertex normal. It's a long way away. And it's usually further down, but it's one side or the other. But the point is, the number is much bigger. So these are the clues to thinning disorders. You get a hot spot on the topography map, you get a hot spot on a relative pachymetry map that is at the same place, and you get a hot spot on the elevation maps that are at the same place, and the one on the back is the most important. Because the front gets rubbed off by the lid, so the epithelium gets a little thinner, so it obscures that little elevation on the front. So the back surface hot spot, the topography hot spot, and that thinnest point are your clues that there's a problem, okay? So now, so that's all we got to do. We look for red spots and that thinnest point, and look. Okay, now look at that little black dot there. Well, number one, it's not temporal a little bit, and look at that distance. That distance up there is, pachymetry min, 1 millimeter below vertex normal. That's 3 times what it should be. Okay? Right there. You know this guy's got a problem. All right. He's got a hot spot here. He's got a hot spot there that's yellow, and he's got a hot spot there that's red. That's all you got to do to make the diagnosis of keratoconus. Now, because we fixed the maps, so you can't change the sensitivity and the scale and the colors, it's easy to get every time. You can't make a mistake. So this is one that in the software that you get that has these examples is considered to be suspicious for keratoconus in the right eye, but not conclusive. Well, I can tell you, this is conclusive. All right? All right, so what were the points? The black circle was 1 millimeter, not 2 to 3/10, and I had 2 out of 3 red spots, and of course, the posterior elevation is the most significant. All right? That relative pachymetry was only about 4.5%, just about orange, but the red was that posterior elevation. Okay, any questions about that? Okay. Now here was the other eye. Now see, at this point, same thing, how far inferior is that guy? 1.34. So I will tell you right now that that black circle and the displacement of the relative pachymetry from vertex normal is the most important point. But of course, you still look at those other ones. And the other thing that you notice is on the tangential map, it gives you a better location of where the nipple of the cone is, just like it corresponds to where the thinnest point on the cornea is. The tangential map is a better geometric description of the shape change in the cornea than the sagittal map, because it actually shows you where the radius actually changes the most. Okay, but anyway, this is how you'd pick that up. So the 4 clues: the displacement of the thinnest point and the red on the bottom row. Okay? Now, let's look at this one. Well, now we got a couple of things. First of all, that thinnest point is not displaced inferiorly. It's actually above. All right? And we do notice, though, that when you look at the pachymetry map, it's not an oval or a circle. It's irregular. Well, that's not normal. Okay? And then we look down here and we see steep below, kind of arcing in. We have a thinnest point down here, relative pachymetry map. And then these elevations that are in the periphery, one of which is below. Okay, well, the idea here is that all that red, you're certainly not going to do refractive surgery on that patient. And the reason is, this is pellucid, all right? Pellucid marginal degeneration. And what happens is, right down here in this area inferiorly, it can happen here at the exposure zones right there, but right down here where it shows it thin, what happens is they get a marginal thinning along that lower zone down in the bottom quadrant. That thinning begins to cause a weakness, and the cornea splays out a little bit, so that when it splays out, the profile comes along and then you get this sharp edge. In other words, it was like this and it splays out with a little bit of a bow, and that bow gives you a very sharp curvature, and that's what's showing up here on the tangential map. And that bow bulging out is causing a thinning in that area, so you get a thinning below, and as it bows out like that, that back surface begins to project forward a little bit, and then you get this. So this is a classic presentation of a pellucid marginal degeneration in which the thinnest spot of the cornea, if anything, actually, because it got thinner below, actually moved up a little bit, okay? But you can't trust that, all right? That upward movement is classic in this case, but it's not always that much, all right? Yes?
Explain that. So on the regular pachymetry map, basically it's dead center, but on the relative one, because it's looking at the adjacent thickness?
No, it's not looking at adjacent. It's looking at the thickness of the cornea as to what it should be at that point.
Oh, okay. So it's not comparing it to itself like it does on some of the other maps. It's what's to a normative database. Why is that red down below is what I'm saying?
Yeah, because what's happened is, here's the margin, let's say this is the peripheral cornea, all right? What's happened is that's actually bulged out and gotten thinner in that area. So that area is thinner than it would be normally.
I understand, but why does it show up on the map? So it's comparing it to what they expected that area. Expect the peripheral cornea to be thicker.
Right.
And that's why it comes up red.
Right.
Even though it's not the thinnest spot.
It's not what?
It's not the thinnest spot in the cornea.
Oh, no, and that's why it's in a percentage.
Right.
Okay? In other words, the relative pachymetry map is in a percent. So what happens is, when it's green, like here, all right, this is still 700 microns thick, okay? But it's supposed to be 700 microns thick, all right? And here it's 555 thick, okay? So what this percentage gives you is how thick it is relative to what it should be at that point, okay? So green is 100%. And if it drops down to, say, 80%, then it's thinner than it should be, and it would show a relative pachymetry percentage of minus 20%, because it's 20% thinner than it should be at that point. You see what I mean? So a green map simply means that it gets thicker as it goes to the periphery, and the periphery is 700 microns, the center is 555, and that all of those are relative to what the thickness should be at that point. So this one should be 700, and that one should be 555. And that difference down there, this is actually still thicker than the central cornea, but it's 6% thinner than it should be. You see what I mean? So if it was 700 is what it should be, say 10%, it'd be 630 out there. So it's thinner than it should be, okay? And that's why the relative pachymetry map is so useful, because on the normal pachymetry map, you have to do that in your head. You see what I mean? And this way, you don't have to do it in your head. It does it for you automatically. All right. And this is just another example of the other eye, okay? And you see here, here's that bulge, here's where the thin area is, and you see where the elevation. So this is just the other eye of that person that had a peripheral marginal degeneration. Okay, now let's look at this one. Let's see how we're doing here. Okay, we look at this. First of all, we look at the K's. Flat, 34, 35, so we know that this is somebody that's much flatter than normal. We look at the map, on the pachymetry map, we see it's much thinner than it should be and much thinner than it should be in the center. We look over here and we see flat spots in the center. And we look over here on the front surface map, it doesn't look much different. But on the back surface elevation map, it shows a 14 micron protrusion and it's red, which means it's bulging out. So this is somebody that has a very flat central cornea, a much thinner than central zone, a thin spot that's dead center in the middle of that central zone, and an elevation on the back surface. And this is ectasia. That's exactly what's happened here. This person has a bulge in the center of their cornea on the back, and it's an ectasia. All right. There's the distribution of power. Again, not bad. Actually, it was a pretty good LASIK, except for the ectasia. All right. Now, power calculations, what I was talking to you about was the EKR 65 takes everything into account that you need to know, that the formulas need to know, that gives you the best estimate of the cornea. So with the EKR 65, you don't have to go to the Ascaris website. You'll get a better value with the EKR 65. And actually, I was talking to Warren yesterday. They're actually going to put the EKR 65 on there. But the point is, you don't need to go up there. The EKR 65 already makes all the adjustments that you can put it right into any of the newer formulas and get the result that you need without any kind of conversion. So it bypasses all of that. All right. And as I was pointing out to you, what the EKR 65 does, if you have a normal cornea and your back surface power is normal, you'll get the same value on the EKR 65 on the 4.5 millimeter zone as you get on the keratometer. But if the back of your cornea is 0.3 of a diopter stronger than normal, so the back surface power is more negative than normal, instead of getting 45 diopters from a front surface power measurement, you'll get 44.7. It actually adjusts for the difference from normal for the back surface power and includes the back surface astigmatism. So what will happen is, on the average, Koch found that the back surface is about 0.2, about a quarter of a diopter against the rule. Okay, so a quarter of a diopter. Okay, now it turns out there's some other factors. So most of the studies show that if you look at the refraction post-op, it's about a half a diopter difference. In other words, about a half a diopter of against the rule is what you should add to your K readings to come out with a spherical refraction. Okay, half a diopter. Now what that means is IOL step sizes are about 0.75. So at the cornea plane, they're about they're less than that. They're about 0.5, 0.55. So what happens is the Baylor nomogram says if you have with the rule astigmatism, back off by 1 step size or a half a diopter. If you have against the rule astigmatism, increase by 1 step size or a half a diopter. What that's doing is adding a half a diopter of against the rule. The EKR65 measures the back surface astigmatism, but that's only half of it. That's only a quarter. So you still need to add a quarter of a diopter of against the rule to the EKR65 if you're going to use a calculator, when you use a calculator to calculate the toricity, because that other quarter of a diopter is from the flattening of the cornea that you get with a temporal incision. Now that's backwards to what we thought. But it turns out when you look at large studies, I've done it with Alcon, I've done it with P&L, and I've done it with AMO in their FDA studies, and what happens is the cornea, a lot of which is on the back surface, ends up flattening by another quarter of a diopter of against the rule, in addition to the quarter of a diopter on the back of the surface that was there to start with. So the result is that you still end up with needing a quarter of a diopter more against the rule than you would have calculated even when you use the EKR65. Okay? So the point is, the easiest way to look at that is this. If you use the EKR65 and you look down on your IOL calculations, all right, it tells you what the residual astigmatism is. Shows you, highlights the one that it recommends, and then shows you what the refraction is going to be on that table. What I'm saying is you want to end up picking the lens that says you have a quarter of a diopter with the rule, which says it'll be plus a quarter, axis 90 degrees. If you pick that with the EKR65, you'll end up with your patients being 0. You want to end up targeting them to have a quarter of a diopter with the rule, and if using the EKR65. That's all that means. Okay. And I'm just pointing out that you would use a half a diopter if you weren't using this many.
There was some discussion about using total corneal power for toric calculations.
Say that again.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. There was some discussion about using total corneal power for toric calculations.
Well, and that's what I'm talking about. You see, that the total, the astigmatism that you measure with the EKR65 is the total corneal astigmatism.
Okay, so we can just look here and use.
That's right.
Okay.
That EKR65 has already taken the astigmatism on the back surface into account.
Okay.
And it's the same value that you get for the astigmatism using total corneal power.
Okay.
Those two will be the same. Now, the difference, though, is there's two. The first is the EKR65 does it for a 4.5 millimeter zone. Okay? Zone. The total corneal power doesn't. It depends on what you've chosen. And usually that's 6 millimeters, so it's way too much. And the second is that the absolute K reading for the total corneal power is what we were talking about before, will be that 1 diopter less than the K reading you need to put in. So you'll end up making a myopic surprise by about a diopter there.
Okay.
So the EKR65 already has the back surface power in there and is the right value. But what I was explaining was that additional quarter of a diopter power that you need, which ends up being a quarter of a diopter with the rule that you look at on your choices, is a fade in the cornea that occurs, all right, after surgery from making a temporal and a vertical incision. And the cornea actually gets a little flatter vertically by a quarter of a diopter when you do that.
Yes.
That second reason, you said the total corneal power is a diopter off compared to the EKR 65?
Right.
Why is that again?
Because the total corneal power, its total corneal power is a net, okay? And what I'm saying is keratometrically, when you take a power measurement of the cornea with a keratometer, you get 45 diopters. I'm saying in every intraocular lens formula that's used today, it's then converted to net power, which is 1 diopter less. And the total net power that's measured with the shine fluid, with the Pentacam, is 44. So if you put the 44 into a lens calc, it reduces it again to 43. You see? So net power is the true net power of the cornea. And it's 1 diopter less than a keratometric reading. So if you were to put the true net power into any calculator today, it's going to reduce it by another diopter. And the EKR 65, I recognize that. It says you can't do that. So the EKR 65 is the true net power, converted back to a K reading, but adjusted for the back surface difference from normal.
And I was at that talk yesterday, and I think what they're saying is that they mentioned you shouldn't use the total corneal power for your lens power calculation just for the toric planar, is what they were saying. That's
Well, no. And here's what I'm saying. You don't use total power for your IOL calculation because you're going to make a mistake.
Right.
And I'm saying that the net power and the EKR 65 give you a value that's almost the same for the astigmatism, okay? Because that 1 diopter difference is reducing it by 1/45th, so it doesn't change the astigmatism much. But the difference is the EKR 65 determines that optimally over a 4.5 millimeter zone, and total net power does not do that over the 4.5 millimeter zone. Okay? So the EKR 65 has the benefit of the astigmatism that you get on total net power, but it's for the right diameter so that you get the exact value that you use. Yeah, Mark.
What I've traditionally done over the last 7 or 8 years is use the Holladay EKR detailed report on post-refractive myopic patients for picking IOL powers using the 2 millimeter EKR. And it's worked quite well in the formulas that we've used. Can you summarize and briefly explain the difference between what I'm doing and what the EKR 65 is?
Between
the EKR 65
and
the EKR and the detailed Holladay report. In other words, you get the 2 millimeter zone, 3 millimeters, 3.5 millimeters, and 4. They gives you the table and it gives you that
Yeah,
spread.
well, no. Yeah, I can. Well, here's what happens, okay? It's what we were talking about in myopic patients. Here's the question you're asking. All right, you've got a cornea that gets flatter and flatter and flatter after post-myopic surgery, and it's flattest in the dead center, okay? Now, if you use the 2 millimeter zone, you're going to get the power that's right in the middle and the flattest one, and you'll never make a hyperopic surprise.
Correct.
Okay? Now, all I was telling you, though, is if you look at the 4.5, the 4, the 3, and the 2, and you look at those, and they all have the same average, it's not going to affect your result because they all have the same average power, and so it's not going to make any difference which one of those you use. And if you look down in that 2 millimeter zone is 1 diopter flatter than the 4.5 millimeter zone, okay, then you know he's got a multifocal cornea that's flattest in the center. And that if you use that 2 millimeter zone and use that flattest K that you get, you'll never ever have a hyperopic surprise. But you'll end up with myopic surprises of a quarter, a half, or whatever. So all I'm saying is that there's nothing wrong with doing that, and that it is always better to err on the myopic side because the patient has some place to see. But if you go back and you plot those, what you'll see is you're on the myopic side of that, and that's nothing wrong with that because I tell people that's a good idea. Because what happens is, if you're on 0, it means you're going to have as many hyperopic surprises as you have myopic surprises. And using the 2 millimeter zone post-refractive surgery, you'll never have a hyperopic surprise, but you will have some myopic surprises. That's
Another question for you.
Yeah.
When looking at corneal sphere collaborations, I traditionally use the Humphrey topographer, and I have the aperture set at 6 millimeters. When you look at the Q values on this, what aperture is it giving you those values at? I don't know if that's, you just said that.
Well, there's two. The Q value that it gives you on that center box,
Right.
on the first page, is 6 millimeters.
It is 6 millimeters. Okay.
Yes. The one that it uses on the back for the elevation, all right, we actually use an 8 millimeter zone, and that Q value on the back for the reference is over an 8 millimeter zone. But the value on the front is for a 6 millimeter zone. But what you'll find is that value on the front first page is the sum of the 4.6 and the 4.8. So it'll be maybe 4 or 5 hundredths higher than you would on another topographer where you're only looking at the 4.0, because it also adds the 6 or the 8. So it won't be exactly the same, because it adds the other two terms that Koch recommends in that paper that's a better match for an aspheric lens.
Thank you.
All right, well look, it's 7:30. Let's see here. I think we're finished anyway, so let's see. Yep, those are your values for your EKR 65. This was that bifocal cornea that I said in keratoconus. And remember I said if you had 2 powers and you have a keratoconic patient, they don't look through that cap for distance. And so the EKR 65 actually looks at that paracentral power and computes what that is and gives you a lower power for the cornea in a keratoconus patient than it would for an average like you get on a regular keratometer. So it works for all of these things: post-refractive, PKP, keratoconus, corneal scar. And those are the maps. And that's what we said there. We don't need to go through a real calculation. Oh, I do want to mention one more thing. The Pentacam AXL. First of all, they're going to put the Holladay 1 formula. It's already done. It's just a matter of be at this show on the Pentacam. So you'll be able to do your IOL calculations actually on the Pentacam using their IOL module. But in addition to that, we are also going to have the ability to import from the Pentacam AXL. Now what that means is the AXL is basically an OCT that measures axial length, so you get all the measurements you need with the combination of the shine flug and the OCT for axial length and ACD, and you get everything together. So what happens is, though, it's going to be where in the Holladay IOL Consultant program that has the Holladay 2, has the toric calculators, has all the analysis stuff that you have. For those of you that have that, the IOL Consultant will be able to import all of the data from the Pentacam AXL into the system, just like it does for the IOL Master and for the LensStar, so that it will be able to do that import so you don't have to manually input anything anyway. And that is, as we speak, already available on their system, and they'll begin doing that right after this show. So what we're saying is that AXL will have the ability to measure the axial length, and the OCT does that. This is the Holladay 1 calculation that you can actually do in the instrument. And what we're saying is all of that stuff will be something that you can do in your Pentacam with the AXL. And in addition, it will export a file that we'll be able to import in the IOL Consultant and pull that in so that you don't have to do any data entry, just like you do now with other instruments. So thank you so much for coming this morning. I'll hang around for a little bit.